The gymnasium at Riverside Academy buzzed with excitement as students prepared for the annual winter formal. Streamers hung from the basketball hoops, disco lights cast colorful patterns across the polished floor, and the DJ tested his equipment with thumping bass lines that made the bleachers vibrate. But for Ms. Jasmine Washington, standing at the entrance in her elegant navy blue dress, this wasn't just another school dance. It was her first major event as a chaperone, and she was already questioning whether she belonged here. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 28, Jasmine had only been teaching English at Riverside Academy for 3 months. The prestigious private school in Connecticut had a reputation for academic excellence, but also for its wealthy, entitled student body that seemed to view teachers as obstacles rather than mentors. She'd taken the job hoping to make a difference, to inspire young minds through literature and writing, but so far, her quiet demeanor and gentle approach had earned her nothing but dismissive looks and whispered comments from students who clearly saw her as an easy target. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight, she wasn't hiding behind her desk or standing at the front of a classroom. She was here as herself, a young woman who had spent hours choosing the perfect dress, styling her natural hair, and carefully applying makeup that highlighted her warm brown eyes. The navy dress hugged her athletic frame in all the right places, its subtle sparkle catching the light as she moved. She looked beautiful, confident even, though inside her stomach churned with familiar anxiety. Jasmine had always been the quiet one, the peacekeeper who avoided confrontation at all costs. Growing up in inner-city Detroit, she'd learned early that keeping her head down and focusing on her studies was the safest path forward. Her mother, a single parent working 2 jobs, had instilled in her the importance of education as a way out of poverty. "Books are your ticket to a better life, baby girl," she'd always said. And Jasmine had believed it with every fiber of her being. But books couldn't protect her from the casual racism she'd encountered at Riverside Academy. The way some students would accidentally mispronounce her name, turning Jasmine into Jasmine or Jasmine. The surprised looks when she'd quote Shakespeare or discuss complex literary themes with passion and expertise. The subtle exclusion from faculty gatherings, where conversations would halt when she approached, replaced by polite but distant smiles. She'd considered quitting multiple times in those first few months. The paycheck was good, far better than what she'd made at the public school in Detroit, but the emotional toll was exhausting. Every day felt like a battle to prove she belonged, to show that she was more than qualified to teach these privileged students who seemed to view her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. What none of them knew was that Jasmine Washington carried secrets beneath her soft-spoken exterior, secrets that had shaped her into someone far stronger than her gentle demeanor suggested. The same financial struggles that had driven her to excel academically had also led her to seek out alternative ways to build confidence and defend herself. At 16, when neighborhood boys had started harassing her on the way home from school, her mother had scraped together enough money for boxing lessons at the local community center. "You're too smart and too pretty for your own good," her mother had said, pressing crumpled bills into her hand. "Learn to protect yourself, because the world ain't always gonna be kind to a girl like you." Mickey's boxing gym had been a revelation. The old converted warehouse smelled of sweat and determination, filled with the rhythmic sound of gloves hitting heavy bags and the shuffle of feet on worn canvas. Mickey Thompson, a former professional boxer who'd opened the gym after his career ended, had taken one look at the shy teenager and seen potential that even Jasmine hadn't recognized in herself. "Boxing ain't just about throwing punches," he'd told her on that first day, wrapping her hands with practiced efficiency. "It's about discipline, respect, and finding your inner strength. You got something special in you, kid. We just gotta bring it out." For the next 6 years, through high school and college, Jasmine had trained religiously. 3 times a week. She'd trade her textbooks for boxing gloves, her quiet classroom persona for the fierce determination that emerged when she stepped into the ring. She'd learned to move with fluid grace, to read her opponent's intentions, to strike with precision and power that belied her gentle nature. Mickey had pushed her to compete, convinced she had what it took to go professional. She'd won several amateur tournaments, her quick footwork and devastating left hook earning her a reputation in Detroit's boxing circles. But Jasmine had always known her future lay elsewhere. Boxing was her sanctuary, her secret weapon against a world that often tried to diminish her. But teaching was her calling. Now, standing in the decorated gymnasium of Riverside Academy, surrounded by students who saw her as nothing more than a soft-spoken English teacher, Jasmine felt the familiar weight of her two worlds pressing against each other. The confident fighter who had dominated in the ring seemed like a different person from the woman who struggled to command respect in the classroom. The dance was already in full swing when she made her way to the chaperone station. Near the punch bowl, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, the senior faculty member who'd been at Riverside for over 2 decades, nodded curtly in her direction. "Ms. Washington, good of you to join us. I trust you'll keep a close eye on the students tonight. Some of them can get rather spirited at these events." There was something in Mrs. Hendricks' tone that made Jasmine's jaw tighten slightly. The older woman had never been openly hostile, but there was an undercurrent of condescension in their every interaction, as if she viewed Jasmine as a temporary addition to the faculty rather than a permanent colleague. "Of course," Jasmine replied, her voice steady despite the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm here to make sure everyone has a safe and enjoyable evening." As the night progressed, Jasmine found herself observing the complex social dynamics that played out on the dance floor. The popular kids clustered together, their designer formal wear and confident attitudes marking them as the school's elite. The athletes, particularly the varsity football players, moved through the crowd with the swagger of young men who'd never been told no. And scattered throughout were the quieter students, the ones who reminded Jasmine of herself at that age, hoping to blend in, to enjoy the evening without drawing unwanted attention. It was during a particularly loud song that she first noticed the group of senior boys gathering near the back corner of the gym. Tyler Morrison, the quarterback whose father owned half the commercial real estate in town. Brad Kensington, whose family name graced the library wing and whose trust fund was already the stuff of legend. And Jake Sullivan, the linebacker whose aggressive playing style had earned him a full scholarship to a Division I college. They were drinking something that definitely wasn't the fruit punch being served at the official refreshment table, passing a flask between them with the casual arrogance of young men who believed themselves untouchable. Jasmine made a mental note to keep an eye on them, but didn't want to create a scene unless absolutely necessary. She was watching them when she noticed their attention had shifted to something or someone else. Following their gaze, she saw they were focused on a group of underclassmen, particularly Maria Santos, a shy sophomore who'd been one of Jasmine's brightest students. Maria was dancing awkwardly with a boy from her grade, clearly uncomfortable but trying to enjoy herself. The predatory way the older boys were watching made Jasmine's skin crawl. She'd seen that look before, in the hallways and classrooms, when students thought teachers weren't paying attention. It was the look of young men who'd been taught that their wants and desires mattered more than anyone else's comfort or consent. Tyler said something to his friends that made them laugh, and they began moving across the dance floor with purposeful steps. Jasmine straightened, her teacher instincts kicking in. She started to move in their direction, ready to intervene if necessary, but was stopped by Mrs. Hendricks' hand on her arm. "Let them have their fun," the older woman said quietly. "Boys will be boys, and we don't want to make a scene over nothing." The dismissive comment hit Jasmine like a physical blow. Boys will be boys. The same phrase that had been used to excuse inappropriate behavior for generations, that had allowed countless young women to be victimized while adults looked the other way. She gently removed Mrs. Hendrick's hand from her arm, her voice calm but firm. "I'm going to make sure everything stays appropriate," she said, not waiting for a response. By the time she reached the area where the boys had been heading, they'd already made contact with Maria and her friends. Tyler was standing too close to the younger girl, his hand resting possessively on her waist despite her obvious discomfort. Brad and Jake flanked them, effectively trapping Maria in a circle of unwanted attention. "Excuse me," Jasmine said, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned to project in the classroom. "Is everything all right here?" Tyler looked up with barely concealed annoyance. "Everything's fine, Ms. Washington. Just getting to know some of the underclassmen, school spirit, and all that." The smirk on his face told a different story. This was a young man who'd been challenged by adults before, and had learned that his family's wealth and influence would protect him from any real consequences. He expected Jasmine to back down, to accept his obvious lie and move on. "Maria," Jasmine said, addressing the younger girl directly, "would you like to help me with something at the refreshment table?" The relief in Maria's eyes was immediate and obvious. "Yes, Ms. Washington, I'd be happy to help." But as Maria tried to step away from the group, Tyler's grip on her waist tightened. "Actually, we were just about to dance, weren't we, Maria?" The threat was subtle but clear. Maria's face paled, and she looked desperately at Jasmine for help. It was a moment that would define everything that followed, a test of whether Jasmine would stand up for her student or cave to the pressure of not wanting to cause trouble. "I think Maria has made her choice," Jasmine said, stepping closer to the group. "And I think you boys should find partners who are actually interested in dancing with you." The comment hit its mark. Tyler's face flushed red, and his friends exchanged looks that promised trouble. These were young men who weren't used to being challenged, especially not by a teacher they clearly viewed as inferior. "You know, Ms. Washington," Tyler said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "maybe you should focus on teaching and leave the social aspects of the evening to people who understand how things work around here." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The barely concealed racism in his comment made Jasmine's hands clench into fists at her sides. She'd heard variations of this theme before, the suggestion that she didn't belong, that she couldn't understand the culture of privilege that defined Riverside Academy. But tonight, in front of her students, with a young girl looking to her for protection, something inside her refused to back down. "I understand perfectly how things work," she replied, her voice steady despite the fire building in her chest. "And what I see right now is inappropriate behavior that needs to stop immediately." The confrontation had drawn attention from other students and faculty. Jasmine was aware of eyes turning their way, of whispered conversations and cell phones being discreetly raised to record whatever was about to happen. This was the moment she'd been dreading since taking the job, the moment when her commitment to her students would be tested against the school's unwritten rules about not rocking the boat. Tyler released Maria's waist but stepped closer to Jasmine, using his height advantage to try to intimidate her. "You're new here, so maybe you don't understand. But some of us have been at this school longer than you've been teaching. Our families built this place, so maybe you should know your place." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Know your place. The phrase carried centuries of ugly history, designed to put her back in what he considered her proper position in the social hierarchy. Around them, the music continued to play, but the immediate area had gone quiet as students and faculty sensed the tension building. Jasmine felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that she'd learned to recognize from her boxing training. Her body was preparing for conflict, her muscles tensing, her senses sharpening. But instead of retreating into her shell, as she might have done months ago, she stood her ground. "My place," she said quietly, "is protecting my students. All of them. And right now, that means making sure everyone at this dance feels safe and respected." What happened next would change everything, not just for Jasmine, but for every student watching, every faculty member present, and for the culture of Riverside Academy itself. The shy English teacher who'd spent months trying to fit in was about to discover that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in boxing rings, but in the moments when we choose to stand up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Tyler Morrison's face had hardened into the expression of someone who'd never been told no by anyone he considered beneath him. His friends flanked him like a pack, their expensive tuxedos and polished shoes making them look like wolves in sheep's clothing. The surrounding students had formed a loose circle, some pretending to dance while others openly stared at the brewing confrontation. "You know what your problem is, Miss Washington?" Tyler's voice carried that particular brand of cruelty that came from years of privilege and unchecked entitlement. "You think because you have a degree and a teaching license, you're somehow equal to the families that built this school. But you're not. You're just the help." The words hit like a physical slap. Around them, several students gasped audibly, while others reached for their phones to capture what was clearly about to become a viral moment. Jasmine felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her throat, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times growing up when people tried to make her feel small, insignificant, less than, but this time was different. This time she wasn't a scared teenager trying to navigate hostile territory alone. She was a grown woman with 6 years of boxing training, a master's degree in education, and the responsibility of protecting her students. More importantly, she was standing in front of young people who needed to see that bullying and racism wouldn't be tolerated, not even when it came from the children of the wealthy and powerful. "Tyler," she said, her voice carrying a new edge. That made several students take notice. "I'm going to ask you one more time to step back and find appropriate partners for dancing. This conversation is over." Instead of backing down, Tyler's smirk widened. He glanced at his friends who were now openly snickering, then back at Jasmine. "What are you going to do if I don't? Run to the principal? Call my daddy? Good luck with that." The casual dismissal might have been the end of it. Jasmine could have walked away, reported the incident, and let the school's administration handle it through proper channels. But Tyler Morrison had made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that because she was quiet and respectful, she was weak. He'd mistaken her professionalism for cowardice. Actually, Brad Kensington chimed in, emboldened by his friend's bravado. "Maybe we should teach Ms. Washington about school traditions. Show her how we really celebrate at Riverside Academy." The threat was unmistakable. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't going to be a simple verbal confrontation. Jasmine's boxing instincts kicked in, her body automatically shifting into a more balanced stance. Years of training had taught her to read aggressive body language, and everything about these 3 boys screamed danger. "That's enough," she said firmly, positioning herself between the boys and Maria, who was now visibly shaking. "This ends now." But Tyler had already made his move. With the lightning-fast reflexes of a varsity quarterback, he lunged forward. Not toward Jasmine, but toward the neckline of her dress. His intention was clear: to humiliate her in front of the entire student body, to strip away her dignity and authority in one devastating moment. His fingers caught the fabric of her dress, just above the neckline, and with a violent yank, he tore downward. The sound of ripping fabric echoed through the suddenly silent gymnasium as the elegant navy dress split from collar to waist, exposing Jasmine's black bra and the toned muscles of her abdomen. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Cell phones materialized as if by magic, camera flashes going off like paparazzi at a red carpet event. Students gasped, some in shock, others in cruel delight. The DJ, oblivious to the drama, continued playing upbeat dance music that now seemed grotesquely inappropriate for the moment. For a heartbeat, Jasmine stood frozen, her hands instinctively moving to cover herself. The humiliation was complete, public, and seemingly irreversible. In that moment, she was transported back to every time she'd been made to feel small. Every instance where someone had tried to reduce her to nothing more than her race, her gender, her perceived powerlessness. But then something extraordinary happened. Instead of crumbling, instead of running away in tears as Tyler and his friends clearly expected, Jasmine felt something else entirely. A cold, calculating fury that had been building for months of subtle disrespect and casual racism. A rage that had been refined and focused through years of boxing training into something far more dangerous than mere anger. She straightened to her full height, her torn dress forgotten, her eyes locked onto Tyler's with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward. The shy English teacher was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she could tear apart anyone foolish enough to challenge her. "You made a mistake," she said, her voice so quiet that students strained to hear her. "A very big mistake." Tyler, still high on adrenaline and the approval of his friends, didn't recognize the danger he was in. "What are you going to do about it, Teach? Cry? Run home to mommy?" The taunt was his final error in judgment. With fluid grace that spoke of countless hours of training, Jasmine's right hand shot forward in a perfect jab that caught Tyler square in the nose. The sound of cartilage cracking was audible even over the music as blood immediately began streaming down his face, but she wasn't finished. As Tyler stumbled backward, his hands instinctively moving to his broken nose, Jasmine followed up with a left hook that connected with his jaw with the precision of a surgeon and the power of a professional fighter. The impact lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into the nearby refreshment table, sending punch bowls and decorative flowers flying. The gymnasium erupted in chaos. Students screamed, scattered, and pushed each other to get better views of the unfolding drama. But Jasmine wasn't paying attention to the crowd. Her focus was entirely on the remaining threats in front of her. Brad Kensington, who had been laughing moments before, now looked like he'd seen a ghost. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, backing away from the woman who had just demolished his friend with two perfectly executed punches. "Hey, wait a minute. You were just what?" Jasmine interrupted, stalking toward him with the predatory grace of a fighter who smelled victory. "Just assaulting a teacher? Just humiliating a woman in front of her students?" Brad's retreat ended when he backed into Jake Sullivan, who was staring at Jasmine with a mixture of fear and something that might have been respect. The linebacker was used to being the biggest, strongest person in any room, but there was something about the way Jasmine moved, the casual confidence with which she dispatched Tyler, that made him reconsider his options. "Look, we're sorry," Jake said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "We didn't mean for it to go this far. We were just having some fun." "Fun?" Jasmine's laugh was devoid of humor. "You think sexually assaulting a teacher is fun? You think humiliating someone in front of their students is entertaining?" She continued her advance, and both boys continued backing away until they found themselves trapped against the gymnasium wall. The woman in front of them bore no resemblance to the quiet English teacher they'd thought they could bully with impunity. This was someone who moved like a predator, who radiated controlled violence, who looked like she could and would hurt them badly if they gave her the slightest provocation. "Here's what's going to happen," Jasmine said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "You're going to help your friend Tyler to the nurse's office. You're going to explain to your parents exactly what you did tonight and why. And you're going to pray that I don't decide to press charges for assault." The threat hung in the air like a sword. Both boys nodded frantically, clearly desperate to escape the situation with their dignity and their consciousness intact. They moved to help Tyler, who was still dazed from the combination of a broken nose and a concussion. blood staining his expensive tuxedo shirt. As they half-carried, half-dragged their friend toward the exit, Jasmine became aware of the absolute silence that had fallen over the gymnasium. The music had stopped, the DJ apparently having finally noticed the drama unfolding on his dance floor. Every eye in the room was on her, some filled with fear, others with admiration, all with a newfound respect for the woman they'd thought they understood. She looked down at her torn dress, at the fabric hanging in tatters around her waist, and felt a surge of the old humiliation. But it was quickly replaced by something else: pride. She had defended herself, protected her student, and shown every person in that room that she wouldn't be intimidated or disrespected. Principal Margaret Foster came rushing across the dance floor, her face flushed with exertion and what looked like panic. "Ms. Washington, what on earth happened here? Are you hurt? Do we need to call the police?" Jasmine straightened her shoulders and met the principal's gaze with steady eyes. "3 of your students just committed assault, Principal Foster. They tore my dress, humiliated me in front of the entire student body, and threatened a younger student. I defended myself using reasonable force." The principal's eyes widened as she took in the scene: the overturned refreshment table, the blood on the floor, the crowd of students still staring in shock. "We need to get you something to cover up with. And then we need to discuss this situation immediately." But as teachers scrambled to find Jasmine a jacket and students began whispering excitedly about what they'd just witnessed, one thing was crystal clear: the quiet English teacher from Detroit had just changed everything at Riverside Academy. The question now was whether the school and its privileged student body was ready for the consequences of underestimating her again. The emergency meeting in Principal Foster's office felt like a trial, with Jasmine sitting across from a panel of administrators who seemed more concerned about potential lawsuits than the assault that had precipitated the evening's events. She'd been given an oversized Riverside Academy sweatshirt to cover her torn dress, but the humiliation of the attack still burned in her chest as she faced questions that seemed designed to make her the villain rather than the victim. "Ms. Washington," said Dr. Richard Pemberton, the school superintendent, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in education and zero tolerance for anything that might disrupt his carefully maintained reputation. "While we certainly don't condone the students' behavior, we have to address the fact that you physically assaulted minors. Tyler Morrison required 12 stitches and has a concussion. His parents are already talking about pressing charges." Jasmine kept her hands folded calmly in her lap, though every instinct screamed at her to defend herself more forcefully. "Dr. Pemberton, I was sexually assaulted in front of 200 students. I defended myself using reasonable force after being threatened and humiliated. Any charges the Morrison family wants to press will be met with charges of their own." The room fell silent. Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, who had been notably absent during the actual confrontation, cleared her throat nervously. "Perhaps we should consider that Ms. Washington might have overreacted to what was essentially a prank. Boys will be boys after all." The phrase hung in the air like a red flag. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, there was a sharp knock on the office door. Principal Foster's secretary entered without waiting for permission, her face flushed with excitement. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you all need to see." The entire incident was recorded by multiple students, and the videos are already spreading across social media. But there's more. Channel 7 News is on their way. They want to interview Ms. Washington about what they're calling the teacher who fought back. The color drained from Dr. Pemberton's face. Nothing terrified school administrators more than negative media attention, especially when it involved assault allegations and privileged students. Videos? What exactly do they show? "Everything," the secretary replied, holding up her phone. "Tyler Morrison tearing Ms. Washington's dress, the verbal harassment, the threats. But they also show her defending herself. The comments are While they're overwhelmingly supportive of Ms. Washington, Principal Foster reached for the phone, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the footage. Her expression shifted from concern to something approaching relief as she saw the clear evidence of what had actually transpired. This changes things considerably. But Jasmine was no longer interested in the political calculations of administrators trying to protect their reputations. She stood up, her voice carrying the same authority that had stopped Tyler Morrison in his tracks. I don't need your permission to speak to the media. I don't need your approval to tell my story. And I certainly don't need your protection from the consequences of defending myself. She moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to face the panel of administrators who had been ready to sacrifice her to preserve their relationships with wealthy donors. But I do need to know whether Riverside Academy stands behind teachers who protect their students, or whether you're more concerned with appeasing families who think their money buys them immunity from consequences. The challenge was unmistakable. Dr. Pemberton and Principal Foster exchanged glances, both recognizing the no-win situation they found themselves in. Side with the wealthy families, and they'd face a media firestorm portraying them as enablers of assault. Support Jasmine, and they'd anger some of their most generous benefactors. Ms. Washington, Dr. Pemberton said carefully, perhaps we should discuss this more privately. The school is prepared to offer you our full support, including legal representation and counseling services. We simply need to coordinate our response to ensure what? Jasmine interrupted. That your public relations team can spin this into something more palatable. That you can minimize the damage to your reputation while throwing me under the bus? The accusation hit its mark. Mrs. Hendricks looked uncomfortable, while Principal Foster at least had the decency to appear ashamed. But it was Dr. Pemberton's response that revealed the true nature of the institution Jasmine had been trying so hard to fit into. Ms. Washington, you have to understand our position. The Morrison family has been generous supporters of this school for 3 generations. Tyler's grandfather literally built the science wing. His father chairs our board of trustees. You can't simply hold their son accountable for sexual assault. Jasmine's voice was deadly quiet. You can't simply protect your teachers from being humiliated and attacked. You can't simply do the right thing because it might cost you a donation. She didn't wait for an answer. The conversation had told her everything she needed to know about where the school's priorities lay. Walking out of the office, she felt a strange sense of liberation. For months, she'd been trying to prove herself worthy of their acceptance, bending herself into shapes that never quite fit. Now she understood that the problem wasn't with her. It was with a system that valued money over morality, status over safety. The hallways of Riverside Academy looked different as she walked toward the exit. The elegant architecture and expensive artwork that had once intimidated her now seemed like elaborate decorations covering a rotten foundation. She'd spent so much energy trying to belong in a place that was never going to accept her as an equal. But as she reached the main entrance, she was surprised to find Maria Santos waiting by the front doors, still in her formal dress, but with a determined expression that reminded Jasmine of herself at that age. The younger girl wasn't alone. She was surrounded by at least a dozen other students, all looking at Jasmine with expressions of gratitude and respect. Ms. Washington, Maria said, her voice stronger than Jasmine had ever heard it in class. We wanted to thank you, not just for tonight, but for showing us that we don't have to accept being treated badly just because someone has money or power. The words hit Jasmine like a physical blow, but this time it was a good kind of impact. She'd been so focused on the political implications of her actions that she'd forgotten the most important part, the students who had witnessed everything. The young people who had seen their teacher refuse to be victimized, who had watched her stand up to bullies even when it meant risking her career. You don't need to thank me, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You just need to remember That you're worth defending, all of you. A sophomore named David Chen stepped forward, his usually quiet demeanor replaced by something that looked like courage. Ms. Washington, we started a petition. We want the school to know that we support you, that we don't want teachers to be afraid to protect us from students who think they can do whatever they want. The petition, displayed on his phone, already had over 300 signatures, nearly half the student body. The comment section was filled with stories of other incidents, other times when privileged students had crossed lines without consequences, other moments when teachers had looked the other way rather than confront powerful families. "We're not going to let them get away with this," said Rebecca Martinez, a junior who had been one of Jasmine's most engaged students. "We're going to make sure everyone knows what really happened, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen." Again, the determination in their voices was both inspiring and heartbreaking. These were teenagers who had learned harsh lessons about power and privilege, who had discovered that adults didn't always protect them the way they should. But they were also young people who had been inspired by watching someone fight back, someone who had shown them that standing up to bullies was possible. As Jasmine looked at the faces surrounding her, students of different races, economic backgrounds, and social status united by a shared sense of justice, she realized that her months at Riverside Academy hadn't been a failure. She had made a difference, just not in the way she'd expected. Instead of fitting into their system, she'd shown them that the system needed to change. The sound of approaching news vans interrupted the moment. Through the glass doors, Jasmine could see reporters setting up cameras, producers talking on phones, and the general chaos that accompanied a breaking story. The shy English teacher who had walked into this school 3 months ago would have been terrified by the attention. But the woman who had just knocked out Tyler Morrison with 2 perfect punches was ready to tell her story to the world. "Ms. Washington," Maria said quietly, "whatever happens next, we want you to know that you're the best teacher we've ever had. Not because you're perfect, but because you showed us how to be brave." As Jasmine walked toward the doors to face the media, she carried with her the knowledge that she had already won the most important battle. She hadn't just defended herself, she'd inspired a generation of students to demand better, to expect more, and to never accept that bullying was simply boys being boys. The real fight was just beginning. The bright television lights felt harsher than anything Jasmine had faced in Nikki's boxing gym, but she sat perfectly straight in the chair across from Channel 7's veteran reporter, Sarah Chun. The interview was being conducted on the front steps of Riverside Academy, with the imposing brick facade and brass nameplate serving as a backdrop that spoke volumes about privilege and power. "Ms. Washington," Sarah began, her voice carrying the practiced empathy of someone who had covered dozens of similar stories. "Can you walk us through what happened at the winter formal that led to you defending yourself against 3 varsity athletes?" Jasmine had spent the past hour preparing for this moment, but now that the cameras were rolling, she felt the weight of every word. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about every teacher who had been disrespected, every woman who had been assaulted, every person who had been told to stay quiet to protect someone else's reputation. "Tyler Morrison sexually assaulted me in front of 200 students," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "He tore my dress from collar to waist while his friends encouraged him and recorded it on their phones. When I defended myself, I used the minimum force necessary to stop the attack and protect myself from further harm." The reporter leaned forward. "Slightly. You have an extensive background in boxing, is that correct? Some people are saying that your response was disproportionate to the threat." It was the question Jasmine had been expecting, the attempt to paint her as the aggressor rather than the victim. She'd seen this narrative before, the way victims were blamed for defending themselves too effectively, as if there was an acceptable level of assault that should be tolerated before fighting back became justified. "I have 6 years of boxing training," she confirmed. "That training taught me discipline, control, and precision. If I had wanted to seriously injure Tyler Morrison, I could have. Instead, I used 2 controlled strikes to neutralize the threat and create distance. A broken nose and concussion are minor injuries compared to what I could have inflicted. Behind the reporter, Jasmine could see a growing crowd of supporters. Students from Riverside Academy had been joined by parents, teachers from other schools, and community members who had heard about the incident on social media. Some carried signs reading "Teachers deserve respect" and "End school bullying." Others held up phones, live streaming the interview to their own followers. What would you say to critics who argue that teachers should handle these situations through proper channels rather than resorting to violence? Sarah asked. Jasmine's laugh was sharp and bitter. Proper channels? I reported inappropriate behavior from these students multiple times over the past 3 months. I documented incidents of verbal harassment, sexual comments, and intimidation. Each time I was told that boys will be boys, or that I needed to understand the culture of the school. The proper channels failed me long before I had to defend myself. The crowd behind the reporter began to murmur in agreement. Several teachers who had driven from neighboring districts nodded knowingly. They had their own stories of administrative indifference, their own experiences with students who believed wealth and privilege made them untouchable. We've received some interesting information about the Morrison family's history with Riverside Academy. Sarah continued, consulting her notes. Can you tell us about any pressure you might have felt to overlook behavior from certain students? This was dangerous territory. Jasmine knew that anything she said about the school's preferential treatment of wealthy families could result in litigation. But she also knew that silence would only perpetuate a system that protected predators and punished victims. I was explicitly told by faculty members that some families were untouchable because of their financial contributions to the school, she said carefully. I was advised to pick my battles and focus on students whose parents couldn't threaten the school's funding. This creates an environment where certain students believe they can act without consequences. The revelation sent ripples through the crowd. Parents exchanged shocked glances, while students began whispering excitedly. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about a systemic problem that had been hidden behind expensive suits and generous donations. Sarah, Chun's producer, approached and whispered something in her ear. The reporter's eyebrows rose slightly as she received what was apparently breaking news. Ms. Washington, we've just learned that the Morrison family has issued a statement through their attorney. They're claiming that you attacked their son without provocation and that they intend to pursue criminal charges against you. How do you respond to that? Jasmine had been expecting this as well. Rich families didn't just accept public humiliation, they fought back with lawyers and public relations firms, trying to control the narrative and protect their reputations. But this time, they had miscalculated badly. The Morrison family is welcome to pursue any charges they feel are appropriate, she said calmly. I have video evidence from multiple angles showing their son committing sexual assault. I have witnesses who heard his verbal harassment and threats. I have documentation of previous incidents that were ignored by the school administration. I'm confident that any jury will see exactly what happened. As if summoned by her words, Maria Santos appeared at the edge of the crowd, flanked by the group of students who had supported Jasmine earlier. They moved toward the interview area with the purposeful stride of young people who had found their voice and weren't afraid to use it. Ms. Washington, Maria called out, loud enough for the cameras to pick up. We want everyone to know that you saved me from those boys. They were threatening me before you stepped in. You protected me when no other adult would. The statement was a bombshell. Sarah Chun immediately turned her attention to the students, recognizing the potential for a powerful human interest angle. Young lady, can you tell us your name and what you witnessed tonight? I'm Maria Santos, and I'm a sophomore at Riverside Academy, Maria said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Tyler Morrison and his friends were harassing me and several other underclassmen. When Ms. Washington tried to help us, they turned on her. She didn't start that fight, she finished it. Other students began chiming in, each adding their own piece to the puzzle. David Chun described months of intimidation from the varsity athletes. Rebecca Martinez talked about inappropriate comments and unwanted touching that had been dismissed as flirting by school officials. One by one, they painted a picture of a school where sexual harassment and bullying were not just tolerated, but actively protected when the perpetrators came from wealthy families. The interview was turning into something much larger than anyone had anticipated. What had started as a simple assault case was becoming an indictment of an entire system, a revelation about how private schools protected their wealthy donors at the expense of everyone else's safety. "We have another development," Sarah announced, pressing her earpiece as she received more information from her producers. Dr. Richard Pemberton, the superintendent of Riverside Academy, has just announced his resignation, effective immediately. The school board is calling an emergency meeting for Monday morning to address what they're calling serious allegations about institutional failures. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Students hugged each other, parents wiped away tears, and teachers from neighboring schools began chanting, "Justice for Jasmine." The resignation of the superintendent was a clear signal that the school board recognized the severity of the situation and was trying to get ahead of what promised to be a devastating public relations disaster. But Jasmine felt no satisfaction in the man's downfall. She was thinking about all the other teachers who had been silenced, all the other students who had been victimized, all the other incidents that had been covered up to protect the school's reputation. One resignation wasn't enough to fix a system that had been broken for decades. "Miss Washington," Sarah said, bringing the focus back to her, "what do you want to see happen next? What changes need to be made to prevent this from happening to other teachers and students?" Jasmine looked directly into the camera, knowing that her words would be heard by thousands of people across the region. "I want to see accountability. Real accountability, not just for the students who assaulted me, but for the administrators who enabled them. I want to see policies that protect teachers and students, regardless of their families' bank accounts. And I want to see a cultural change that teaches young people that wealth and privilege don't give them the right to hurt others." She paused, feeling the weight of the moment. "Most importantly, I want every teacher watching this to know that they don't have to accept being treated as second-class citizens. We have the right to be respected, protected, and supported by our administrations. And if they won't stand up for us, then we have to stand up for ourselves." The interview concluded with thunderous applause from the crowd, but Jasmine knew this was just the beginning. The real work of changing the culture at Riverside Academy and schools like it across the country was still ahead. But for the first time since taking the job, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. As the news crews packed up their equipment and the crowd began to disperse, Maria Santos approached her one more time. "Ms. Washington, whatever happens with your job, I want you to know that you changed our lives tonight. You showed us that we don't have to be victims." Looking at the young girl's determined face, Jasmine realized that she had accomplished something far more important than keeping her job or winning a legal battle. She had inspired a new generation of students to demand better, to expect more, and to never accept that power meant the right to abuse others. The shy English teacher was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the most important lessons couldn't be found in textbooks. 3 weeks after the winter formal incident, Jasmine walked through the halls of Riverside Academy to a completely transformed atmosphere. The whispered conversations that had once carried undertones of mockery now held notes of respect and admiration. Students who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible now met her eyes directly, some offering tentative smiles, others nodding with genuine appreciation. The emergency school board meeting had resulted in sweeping changes. Dr. Pemberton's resignation had been just the beginning. 2 board members with close ties to the Morrison family had stepped down under pressure, and a new policy manual had been implemented that explicitly prohibited preferential treatment based on family donations or social status. More importantly, an independent oversight committee had been established to investigate complaints against students from influential families. Tyler Morrison, Brad Kensington, and Jake Sullivan had been expelled permanently. The Morrison family's threats of criminal charges had evaporated when their high-powered attorney reviewed the overwhelming video evidence and advised them that pursuing the case would only result in more negative publicity. Tyler had been arrested on charges of sexual assault and was currently awaiting trial, his college scholarship revoked, and his future plans in ruins. But the most significant change was evident in the students themselves. The incident had sparked something that Jasmine was only beginning to understand: a movement among young people who had finally seen an adult willing to fight for them, literally and figuratively. "Ms. Washington, do you have a minute?" The voice belonged to Amanda Chun, a junior who had never spoken up in class before the incident. Now she stood in Jasmine's doorway with a confidence that seemed to radiate from within, holding a folder thick with papers. "Of course, Amanda. What can I do for you?" Amanda entered the classroom and carefully placed the folder on Jasmine's desk. "This is a comprehensive report documenting harassment incidents at Riverside Academy over the past 3 years. We've collected testimonies from 67 students, ranging from verbal abuse to physical assault. We want to present it to the new administration as evidence that the problems here run much deeper than just what happened at the dance." Jasmine opened the folder and felt her heart sink as she read through page after page of detailed accounts. Stories of teachers who had been verbally abused by students whose parents threatened to withdraw funding. Incidents of sexual harassment that had been dismissed as teenage behavior. Cases of racial and economic discrimination that had been ignored or actively covered up. "Amanda, this is incredible work, but also heartbreaking. How did you organize all of this?" "Maria Santos started it," Amanda explained. After she testified at the board meeting, other students began reaching out to her with their own stories. "We realized that your situation wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that had been going on for years. We formed what we're calling the Student Justice Coalition, and we're not going to stop until every voice is heard." The folder contained more than just testimonies. There were carefully researched policy recommendations, proposed disciplinary procedures that couldn't be influenced by family wealth, and a detailed plan for creating a truly safe learning environment. These teenagers had essentially created a blueprint for institutional reform, all inspired by watching their English teacher refuse to be victimized. "There's something else," Amanda continued, her voice taking on an excited tone. "We've been contacted by student groups at other private schools across Connecticut. They want to start their own justice coalitions. What happened here is apparently not unique privileged students getting away with harmful behavior because their families donate money is a problem at elite schools everywhere." The scope of what Jasmine had inadvertently started was beginning to dawn on her. What had felt like a personal crisis was becoming a regional movement, with students across multiple schools organizing to demand better treatment and accountability from their institutions. "Ms. Washington," Amanda said, her voice becoming more serious, "we want to ask you something, and we understand if you say no. We're organizing a regional conference for next month called Students for Safe Schools. We want to invite representatives from 15 different private schools to share their experiences and develop a unified plan for change. Would you be willing to be our keynote speaker?" The request caught Jasmine completely off guard. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have been able to speak confidently to a classroom of 30 students. Now teenagers were asking her to address hundreds of young people from across the region about standing up to institutional power. "I'm honored that you'd ask," she replied carefully, "but are you sure I'm the right person for this?" I'm just a teacher who defended herself. You students are the ones doing the real work of creating change." Amanda's smile was knowing and wise. Beyond her years. "Miss Washington, with all due respect, you're not just a teacher who defended herself. You're someone who showed us that adults can keep their promises to protect us. You're someone who proved that standing up to bullies is possible, even when those bullies have money and power. And you're someone who turned a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for justice." Before Jasmine could respond, there was a knock on the classroom door. Maria Santos entered, followed by a man in a perfectly tailored suit who looked completely out of place in the high school setting. "Ms. Washington," Maria said with barely contained excitement, "this is Mr. James Rodriguez from the Connecticut State Department of Education. He's here because of the Student Justice Coalition's report." Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with high-stakes situations. "Ms. Washington, I want to personally thank you for your courage in coming forward about the systemic issues at this institution. The testimonies your students have collected have triggered a statewide investigation into disciplinary practices at private schools. We're particularly interested in patterns of discrimination and preferential treatment based on family wealth. The implications were staggering. What had started as a single act of self-defense was now prompting state-level oversight of private school policies." Jasmine felt a mixture of pride and overwhelming responsibility. Her actions had opened doors that might never have been opened otherwise. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, "these students deserve all the credit. They're the ones who had the courage to speak out about years of injustice. I just provided the spark." "With respect, Ms. Washington, sparks are often the most important part of creating change. Without someone willing to take the first brave step, movements never begin." He turned to address Amanda and Maria as well. "The Department of Education would like to formally recognize the Student Justice Coalition for their work in documenting these issues. We're also prepared to offer grant funding to support your regional conference and any ongoing advocacy work." The recognition from state officials validated everything the students had been working toward. But more than that, it sent a clear message to private schools across Connecticut that the era of looking the other way when wealthy students misbehaved was over. After Mr. Rodriguez left, Jasmine found herself alone with Amanda and Maria in the Mezziele quiet classroom. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the desks where she had spent so many hours trying to inspire students to think critically about literature and life. "You know," Maria said thoughtfully, "when I was younger, I used to think that standing up to bullies only happened in movies or books. Real life seemed too complicated, too unfair. But watching you that night at the dance... it changed something in my mind. It made me realize that heroes aren't fictional characters. They're just regular people who choose to do the right thing when it matters." Amanda nodded in agreement. "My little sister goes to Riverside Elementary. Last week, when a group of older boys were picking on her friend, she stood up to them. When I asked her why, she said she learned from Ms. Washington that sometimes you have to fight back. That's when I realized that what you did isn't just changing our school. It's changing how an entire generation thinks about standing up for themselves and others." The weight of their words settled over Jasmine like a warm blanket. For months, she had struggled with feeling like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong in the world of Riverside Academy. Now she understood that belonging wasn't about fitting into an existing system. It was about having the courage to change that system when it was broken. "There's one more thing," Amanda said, reaching into her backpack and pulling out an official-looking document. "The new school board voted unanimously to offer you a permanent position as Director of Student Advocacy. It's a newly created role. That would give you the authority to investigate complaints, implement anti-harassment policies, and work directly with students who need support. They want you to basically institutionalize what you've been doing informally." Jasmine stared at the job offer, hardly believing what she was reading. 6 months ago, she had been a probationary teacher hoping just to survive her first year. Now she was being offered a position that would give her the power to protect other teachers and students from the kind of treatment she had endured. The salary is significantly higher than what you're making now, Maria added with a grin. And the position comes with a guarantee that you can't be terminated without approval from the State Oversight Committee. They're essentially making you untouchable. As Jasmine looked at the two remarkable young women standing in her classroom, she realized that her transformation was complete. The shy English teacher who had walked through these halls in fear was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that true strength came not from avoiding conflict, but from standing up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. But more importantly, she had learned that individual acts of courage could inspire collective action, that one person's refusal to be victimized could spark a movement that changed everything for everyone. The boxing gloves hanging in her apartment closet had taught her how to fight. But these students had taught her something even more valuable. They had shown her what was worth fighting for. 6 months later, Jasmine stood at the podium of the Hartford Civic Center, looking out at an audience of nearly 2,000 people. The Regional Students for Safe Schools Conference had grown far beyond anyone's expectations, drawing attendees from across New England and even several delegations from other states. The energy in the room was electric, a mixture of determination, hope, and the kind of raw passion that only comes from young people who have discovered their power to create change. When I walked into Riverside Academy 8 months ago, Jasmine began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone system, I thought success meant keeping my head down, avoiding conflict, and gradually earning respect through quiet competence. I was wrong about almost everything. The audience laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that comes from recognition rather than humor. Many of the students in attendance had their own stories of trying to navigate hostile environments, of attempting to fit into systems that seemed designed to exclude them. I was wrong because I thought respect was something that had to be given to me by others. I didn't understand that respect is something you claim for yourself by refusing to accept anything less. I was wrong because I thought avoiding conflict was the same as maintaining peace. I didn't realize that sometimes conflict is necessary to create real peace for everyone. In the front row, Maria Santos sat with Amanda Chun and a dozen other members of the original Student Justice Coalition. Behind them were representatives from 43 different schools, each carrying binders full of documentation about harassment, discrimination, and institutional failures at their own institutions. The movement that had started with one teacher's refusal to be victimized had grown into something unprecedented in private education. But most importantly, Jasmine continued, I was wrong because I thought change happened slowly, through proper channels and polite requests. I didn't understand that sometimes change requires someone to stand up and say enough, in a voice so clear and strong that it can't be ignored. The past 6 months in her new role as Director of Student Advocacy had been a whirlwind of policy implementation, crisis intervention, and culture change. She had investigated dozens of complaints that had been previously dismissed, resulting in expulsions, suspensions, and in several cases, criminal charges against students who had believed themselves untouchable. More importantly, she had worked with students to create peer support networks that ensured no one had to face harassment alone. The transformation at Riverside Academy had been remarkable. The school that had once been known for producing entitled graduates now had a reputation for progressive leadership in student rights and safety. College admissions officers were noting the change, with several Ivy League schools specifically commenting on the quality of character demonstrated by Riverside graduates. The Student Justice Coalition has collected over 400 testimonies from students across 15 states, Jasmine announced, gesturing to the massive binders that line the stage behind her. These aren't just statistics or abstract policy discussions. These are real stories from real young people who refuse to accept that harassment and discrimination were just part of growing up. The audience erupted in applause, with many students rising to their feet. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that her words might be the catalyst for changes that would affect thousands of students for years to come. Today, I want to announce 3 major developments that will change the landscape of private education in this country. First, the Connecticut State Legislature has passed the Student Safety and Accountability Act, which requires all private schools to maintain transparent disciplinary records and submit to regular oversight reviews. No longer will wealthy families be able to buy immunity for their children's harmful behavior. The cheers were deafening. Students jumped to their feet, many wiping away tears as they realized that their voices had been heard at the highest levels of government. The legislation represented something unprecedented: accountability measures that applied equally to all students regardless of their family's economic status. Second, Jasmine continued as the crowd settled down, the National Association of Independent Schools has announced new accreditation standards that specifically address equity, inclusion, and student safety. Schools that fail to meet these standards will lose their accreditation and their ability to participate in federal programs. This announcement was even more significant than the first. Private schools across the country would now be required to demonstrate concrete progress in protecting all students, not just those from wealthy families. The old system of selective enforcement based on family donations was officially dead. And third, Jasmine said, her voice taking on a tone of deep personal satisfaction, Tyler Morrison, Brad Kensington, and Jake Sullivan were convicted last week on charges of sexual assault and conspiracy. They received sentences of 18 months in jail, followed by 2 years of probation and mandatory counseling. The judge specifically noted that wealth and privilege would no longer be accepted as excuses for criminal behavior. The final announcement brought the longest and loudest applause of the evening. For many students in the audience, this represented something they had never expected: to see actual consequences for students who had believed themselves above the law. It sent a clear message that the era of two-tiered justice in elite schools was over. But as the applause died down, Jasmine's expression became more serious. She knew that legislative victories and criminal convictions were only the beginning of the work that needed to be done. However, she said, her voice cutting through the celebration, laws and policies are only as strong as the people willing to enforce them. Real change happens when individual students, teachers, and parents decide that they will no longer tolerate a system that protects predators and silences victims. She paused, looking out at the sea of young faces that represented the future of American education. It happens when a sophomore like Maria Santos decides to speak up about harassment instead of suffering in silence. It happens when students like Amanda Chun organize documentation projects instead of accepting that this is just how things are. It happens when young people refuse to be told that their safety is less important than someone else's donation. Check. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. These were just inspirational platitudes. They were marching orders for a generation of students who had discovered their power to demand better. Each of you has a choice to make when you return to your schools, Jasmine continued. You can go back to the way things were, accepting harassment and discrimination as inevitable parts of the educational experience. Or you can carry this energy, this knowledge, this determination back with you and use it to transform your own institutions. She gestured to a large banner that hung behind the stage, displaying the Student Justice Coalition's motto: safety, respect, accountability for all. This isn't just a slogan, it's a promise we're making to each other and to future students. A promise that no one should have to endure abuse just to get an education. A promise that wealth and status will never again be accepted as excuses for harmful behavior. In the weeks following the conference, The impact was immediate and dramatic. Student justice coalitions were formed at over 60 schools across 12 states. Several high-profile cases of harassment and discrimination were brought to light, resulting in expulsions, administrative changes, and in some cases, criminal charges. Most importantly, a culture shift was taking place. Students were no longer accepting abuse as normal, and administrators were no longer able to ignore complaints. The transformation wasn't just happening in schools. Jasmine had received speaking invitations from corporations, government agencies, and advocacy organizations. Her story had become a symbol of what could happen when someone refused to be victimized, when individual courage sparked collective action. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Mickey Thompson, her old boxing coach from Detroit, had driven 8 hours to attend the conference. After her speech, he had waited patiently in line with hundreds of students wanting to talk with her. "You remember what I told you on that first day at the gym?" he asked when he finally reached the front of the line. "That boxing wasn't just about throwing punches," Jasmine replied, smiling at the memory. "That's right. It was about discipline, respect, and finding your inner strength. But there was something else I didn't tell you then, because you weren't ready to hear it." Mickey's weathered face broke into a proud grin. "The best fighters aren't the ones who win the most matches. They're the ones who inspire other people to stop being afraid." As Jasmine looked back at the auditorium full of students who were planning their own battles against injustice, she understood what Mickey meant. Her greatest victory hadn't been knocking out Tyler Morrison with 2 perfect punches. It had been showing thousands of young people that they didn't have to accept being victims, that they had the power to fight back and win. The shy English teacher who had once been afraid to speak up in faculty meetings was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had learned that true strength wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about having the courage to fight for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible, and she had taught an entire generation of students. The most important lesson of all, that one person's refusal to bow down can light a fire that changes everything for everyone. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't a law or a policy. It's someone who simply refuses to accept that things can't be better. The revolution had begun with 2 boxing hooks in a high school gymnasium, but it would continue. In every classroom, every hallway, and every institution where young people decided they deserved better. And that revolution would be unstoppable, because it was built on the unshakable foundation of human dignity and the simple truth that everyone deserves to be treated with respect. That's how a teacher's boxing gloves became the symbol of a movement that changed education forever. 2 years after the winter formal incident that changed everything, Jasmine Washington stood in front of the mirror. In her new office at the Connecticut Department of Education, adjusting the collar of her navy blue blazer. The governor had personally recruited her to serve as the state's first director of educational equity and student safety, a cabinet-level position that gave her unprecedented authority to investigate and reform educational institutions across Connecticut. The transformation in her life had been extraordinary, but it was nothing compared to the changes she had witnessed in the lives of the students, who had found their voices through the movement she had inadvertently sparked. Today marked the 2nd anniversary of the Student Justice Coalition, and celebrations were planned at schools across the country where similar organizations had taken root. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos, now a senior at Riverside Academy and the elected president of the National Student Advocacy Network. Ms. W. just got accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship. They specifically mentioned my advocacy work in the acceptance letter. Thank you for showing me that I could be more than a victim. The message brought tears to Jasmine's eyes. Maria had transformed from a scared sophomore into a confident young woman who had testified before Congress about student safety issues. Her journey was being replicated by thousands of students across the country who had discovered their power to create change. Another text arrived, this one from Amanda Chun, who was studying journalism at Columbia University and had just published a book about the student safety movement. The Times wants to do a feature story about how the movement has evolved. They want to interview you about the long-term impact. Are you available next week? The media attention had never stopped. Jasmine's story had become a case study in business, schools, law schools, and education programs across the country. She had delivered the commencement address at her alma mater, been featured on the cover of Education Week magazine, and received honorary doctorates from 3 universities. But what mattered most to her were the practical changes that had resulted from the movement. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant announced that Dr. Patricia Williams, the new superintendent of Riverside Academy, had arrived for their monthly consultation meeting. The contrast with the school's previous leadership could not have been more stark. Dr. Williams was a former civil rights attorney who had been specifically recruited to continue the institution's transformation. "Jasmine," Dr. Williams said as she entered the office, using the first-name basis that had developed through their collaborative work, "I have some remarkable updates to share with you about our progress." She placed a thick folder on Jasmine's desk filled with data and testimonials from the past academic year. Harassment incidents are down by 92% compared to 3 years ago. More importantly, reporting has increased by 300%, which means students feel safe coming forward when problems do occur. The statistics were impressive, but Dr. Williams wasn't finished. "We've also seen dramatic improvements in academic performance across all demographic groups. When students feel safe and respected, they're able to focus on learning rather than survival. Our graduation rate is now 98%, and college acceptance rates have improved across every demographic category." Jasmine reviewed the data with satisfaction. The transformation at Riverside Academy had become a model for other elite institutions struggling to address their own cultures of privilege and entitlement. Delegations from private schools across the country regularly visited to study their reformed policies and procedures. "There's something else," Dr. Williams continued, her voice taking on an excited tone. "The Morrison family has approached the school about making a significant donation to establish an anti-bullying center in Tyler's name. They want to turn their family's shame into something positive." The irony was not lost on either woman. Tyler Morrison, the young man whose assault had triggered everything, was now serving the final months of his sentence and had apparently undergone significant personal transformation during his incarceration. His parents, who had initially threatened lawsuits and tried to use their influence to escape consequences, had instead become advocates for accountability and reform. "Tyler wrote a letter that he wants to share with current students," Dr. Williams added, pulling out a handwritten note. "He specifically requested that you review it first to make sure it doesn't minimize what he did or try to excuse his behavior." Jasmine read through the letter carefully. It was a raw, honest account of how privilege and entitlement had corrupted his judgment, leading him to believe that his family's wealth gave him the right to hurt others. More importantly, it was a detailed acknowledgement of the harm he had caused, not just to Jasmine, but to every student who had witnessed his actions and learned that violence was acceptable. "This is genuine," she said finally. "He's taking full responsibility without making excuses or trying to minimize the impact. I think sharing this with students could be powerful, especially if it's part of a broader discussion about accountability and change." Their meeting was interrupted by another knock on the door. This time it was Marcus Thompson, Mickey's son, who had become Jasmine's deputy director and brought a unique perspective from his years working with at-risk youth in urban environments. "Sorry to interrupt," Marcus said, "but we have a situation developing at Fairfield Prep that requires immediate attention. 3 football players have been accused of sexual assault, and the administration is apparently trying to handle it internally to protect the school's reputation. The familiar pattern made Jasmine's jaw tighten. Despite all the progress they had made, despite new laws and oversight mechanisms, some institutions still tried to protect their image rather than their students. But now there was a difference. There were people in positions of authority who would not allow such cover-ups to continue. "Get me everything you can about the situation," Jasmine instructed. "Contact the victims and their families to offer state support services. And make it clear to the Fairfield administration that any attempt to minimize or cover up these allegations will result in a full state investigation and potential loss of accreditation." Marcus nodded and headed for the door, but paused before leaving. "There's some good news too. The student body at Fairfield has already organized protests demanding transparency and accountability. The victims aren't facing this alone. They have hundreds of students supporting them." That development represented perhaps the most significant change of all. Students were no longer accepting that assault and harassment were inevitable parts of school culture. They had learned that collective action could force institutional change, and they were using that knowledge to protect each other. As Marcus left to coordinate the state's response to the Fairfield situation, Jasmine reflected on how different this crisis was from her own experience 2 years earlier. When she had been assaulted, she had faced the choice between suffering in silence or fighting back alone. Students today had support systems, legal protections, and advocacy networks that ensured they would never have to face such situations. In isolation, her computer chimed with an email from the White House Office of Educational Policy. The President's Education Reform Task Force was requesting her input on federal legislation that would extend student safety protections to all educational institutions receiving federal funding. The movement that had begun at one Connecticut private school was now influencing national policy, but perhaps the most meaningful message came from an unexpected source. Jake Sullivan, one of Tyler's co-conspirators, had written from the community service program where he was completing his sentence. Unlike Tyler's genuine transformation, Jake's letter revealed someone who still didn't fully understand the gravity of what he had done, but was at least acknowledging that his actions had been wrong. More significantly, Jake's younger brother, a freshman at Riverside Academy, had become one of the most active members of the current Student Justice Coalition. The cycle of entitled behavior that might have continued through another generation had been broken by the visibility of consequences and the culture of accountability that now permeated the school. Dr. Williams stood to leave, but turned back with one final update. "I almost forgot. We received confirmation that the documentary about the movement will premiere at the Sundance Film Festival next month. The filmmakers want to know if you'll attend the screening." The documentary, titled Two Hooks: How One Teacher's Fight Changed Everything, had been in production for over a year. It featured interviews with dozens of students, teachers, and administrators who had been affected by the movement, as well as policy experts who analyzed its broader impact on American education. "I'll be there," Jasmine replied. "It's important for people to see how individual courage can create collective change." After Dr. Williams left, Jasmine found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time in days. She walked to the window of her office, which overlooked the Connecticut State Capitol, building where legislators were currently debating additional student safety measures. The view reminded her daily that her work had moved far beyond individual crisis intervention to systemic policy change. Her phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. The caller ID showed Mickey Thompson's number from Detroit. Despite his age, her former boxing coach had become one of the movement's most effective advocates, using his gym as a training ground for young people who needed to build confidence and self-defense skills. "Jasmine, you need to see something," Mickey said without preamble. "Turn on Channel 7 News. There's a story about a teacher in Chicago who used her martial arts training to stop a school shooter. She's saying she was inspired by your example." Jasmine quickly found the news channel and watched in amazement as a reporter interviewed Sarah Kim, a high school chemistry teacher who had subdued an armed student using Brazilian jiu-jitsu techniques. The teacher explicitly credited Jasmine's story with giving her the confidence to act rather than hide when students were in danger. "She saved at least a dozen lives," Mickey continued. "And she's saying that watching your interview 2 years ago taught her that teachers have the right and responsibility to protect their students, even if it means using force." The story was both inspiring and sobering. Jasmine had never intended to become a symbol for teacher empowerment, but she recognized that her actions had given other educators permission to be more than passive victims of violence and harassment. The movement had evolved beyond student advocacy to encompass a broader transformation in how society viewed the role of teachers and their authority to maintain safe learning environments. As she watched the news coverage, Jasmine noticed something that made her smile. In the background of the Chicago school where the incident had occurred, she could see students holding signs that read "Students for Safe Schools" and "Justice Coalition." The organizational structures that had begun at Riverside Academy had spread to urban public schools, rural districts, and educational institutions across the country. Her reflection was interrupted by a video call from Elena Martinez, a senior at a high school in Los Angeles who served as the West Coast coordinator for the National Student Advocacy Network. Elena's school had recently won a federal grant to implement a peer mediation program based on models developed by the original Student Justice Coalition. "Miss Washington, I wanted to give you an update on our progress," Elena said, her enthusiasm evident even through the computer screen. "We've trained over 200 student mediators across 15 schools in our district. Disciplinary incidents are down 40%, and student satisfaction surveys show dramatic improvements in feelings of safety and belonging." The success in Los Angeles was being replicated in cities and towns across the country. Student-led advocacy programs had proven more effective than traditional top-down approaches to addressing harassment and discrimination. Young people were more likely to report problems to peers they trusted than to adults they perceived as part of the institutional system. "There's something else," Elena continued. "We're organizing a national conference for next year, the 3rd annual Students for Safe Schools gathering. We expect over 5,000 attendees from all 50 states and several international delegations. The theme is From Courage to Culture Change, and we'd love for you to deliver the keynote address." The growth of the movement continued to astound Jasmine. What had begun as a regional gathering of a few hundred students had evolved into a national organization with chapters in thousands of schools. The Student Justice Coalition had become a permanent fixture in American education, providing young people with the tools and support they needed to advocate for their own safety and dignity. After ending the call with Elena, Jasmine opened her desk drawer and pulled out a framed photograph from the original winter formal incident. It had been taken by a student photographer just moments after she had knocked out Tyler Morrison, showing her standing over his unconscious form with her torn dress and an expression of fierce determination. The image had become iconic, reproduced on t-shirts, posters, and social media posts across the country. But looking at it now, Jasmine saw something different than the symbol of empowerment that others perceived. She saw a woman who had been pushed to her breaking point, who had discovered that sometimes the most important battles couldn't be avoided or negotiated. They had to be fought and won. Her computer chimed with another email, this one from the publisher of her upcoming book, Fighting Back: A Teacher's Guide to Creating Safe Schools. The manuscript, which combined her personal story with practical advice for educators facing similar challenges, was scheduled for release next month and had already generated significant advance interest from school districts across the country. But the message that brought her the most satisfaction came from an unexpected source. Brad Kensington, the 3rd member of the original group of attackers, had written from the nonprofit organization where he was completing his community service. Sentence. Unlike the others, Brad had chosen to work with anti-bullying programs in middle schools, sharing his story with younger students about how privilege and peer pressure had led him to participate in assault. His letter included photographs from his work with 6th and 7th graders, teaching them about consent, respect, and the importance of intervening when they witnessed harmful behavior. The transformation was remarkable. The young man who had once laughed while his friend assaulted a teacher was now dedicating his life to preventing others from making the same mistakes. The day concluded with a phone call from her mother in Detroit, who had become something of a local celebrity as the woman who had raised the teacher who changed education in America. Despite all the accolades and recognition, her mother's pride remained the validation that mattered most to Jasmine. "Baby girl, I saw you on the news again today," her mother said with unmistakable pride in her voice. They were talking about how the movement you started has prevented over 3,000 documented cases of assault and harassment in schools across the country. 3,000 young people who didn't have to suffer because you refused to be a victim. The number was staggering, but Jasmine knew it represented only the documented cases. The broader cultural change, the shift in attitudes about acceptable behavior, the increased reporting of incidents, the improved support systems for victims had likely prevented many more cases that would never appear in any statistics. But, you know what makes me proudest? Her mother continued. It's not the fancy job or the awards or seeing you on television. It's knowing that you kept the promise you made to yourself when you were 16 years old, that you would never let anyone make you feel small again. And in keeping that promise, you've helped thousands of other people keep the same promise to themselves. As Jasmine hung up the phone and prepared to leave her office for the day, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The shy English teacher who had walked into Riverside Academy 3 years earlier would never have imagined that a single act of self-defense could spark a national movement that changed how America thought about education, safety, and the rights of students and teachers. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was the one she saw in herself. The woman who had once been afraid to speak up in faculty meetings now testified before Congress. The teacher who had tried to avoid conflict now sought it out when it meant protecting others from harm. The person who had felt like an outsider in elite educational circles now helped set policy for institutions across the country. Walking to her car in the parking lot of the Connecticut Department of Education, Jasmine passed a group of high school students who were participating in a summer internship program. They were discussing plans for implementing a peer advocacy program at their school, using language and concepts that had become standard vocabulary in the post-movement era of American education. One of them, a young woman who reminded Jasmine of Maria Santos, looked up as she passed. "Ms. Washington, we're huge fans of your work. Could we ask you a question?" "Of course," Jasmine replied, always willing to engage with young advocates. "We want to know how you found the courage to fight back when everyone expected you to just accept what happened. How do you decide when it's time to stop being patient and start being brave?" The question struck at the heart of everything Jasmine had learned over the past 3 years. She thought about all the students who had found their voices, all the teachers who had discovered their power, all the institutions that had been forced to change because people had decided they deserved better. "You don't wait for courage," she said finally. "Courage isn't something you find, it's something you create in the moment. When you decide that protecting yourself and others is more important than protecting the feelings of people who benefit from injustice. You become brave by choosing to be brave, especially when you're terrified." The students nodded, their faces reflecting the same determination that Jasmine had seen in hundreds of young advocates across the country. They were part of a generation that would never accept harassment and discrimination as normal parts of growing up. A generation that understood the power of collective action and the importance of Individual courage. As she drove home through the streets of Hartford, Jasmine thought about the boxing gloves that still hung in her closet, now museum pieces that represented the intersection of personal strength and social justice. Mickey Thompson had been right all those years ago. Boxing wasn't just about throwing punches. It was about discipline, respect, and finding your inner strength. But he had been wrong about one thing. The best fighters weren't the ones who inspired others to stop being afraid. The best fighters were the ones who showed others that they had been brave all along. They just needed someone to remind them that their safety, dignity, and rights were worth fighting for. The movement that had begun with 2 boxing hooks in a high school gymnasium had become something unprecedented in American education. It changed laws, transformed institutions, and most importantly, empowered a generation of young people to demand the respect and safety they deserved. And it all started because one teacher decided that she would rather fight back than bow down. That she would rather risk everything than accept that harassment and humiliation were just part of the job. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a single person who refuses to be a victim. That's how Jasmine Washington's story became America's story, and how 2 perfect punches changed education forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.